Hello and welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us today at the Skirball Cultural Center's virtual literary program celebrating author Rebekah Donner's latest release, All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days, the true story of the American woman at the heart of the German resistance to Hitler. My name is Isabel Rosenthal and I'm the Public Programs Associate at the Skirball. The Skirball is deeply inspired and guided by the Jewish values of welcoming all and to honor memory, to pursue justice, and to build a more fair and just society. On behalf of the Skirball, I would like to thank Rebekah and Howard Farber and the Engaging the Census Foundation for their support of this program, as well as other literary programs this spring, which will amplify the voices of extraordinary women. It is now my great pleasure to introduce a cherished friend to the Skirball, Louise Steinman, who is a writer, an artist, a literary curator, and a cultural correspondent. Louise co-directs the Los Angeles Institute for Humanities at USC. She was the founder and for 25 years, the curator of the Allowed Literary Series at the Los Angeles Public Library. She's the author of 3 books, and her memoir of the Polish-Jewish reconciliation, The Crooked Mirror, was recently published in Polish translation. It is with tremendous gratitude that I welcome Louise onto our virtual stage today in conversation with Rebekah Donner. Without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Louise. Louise, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. It's such an honor to be here and to be interviewing Rebekah Donner for the Skirball. I'm going to give a brief introduction for Rebekah, who is the author most recently, as Isabel said, of All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days, the true story of the American woman at the heart of the German resistance to Hitler. Rebekah is also the author of 2 other books, Sunset Terrace, a critically acclaimed novel, and Burnout, a graphic novel on eco-terrorism. She was a 2018-19 fellow at the Leon Levy Center for Biography at City University of New York. And to bring us up to date, All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days is shortlisted for 2 awards, the 2022 National Book Critics Circle Award for biography and the Penn Jacqueline Bogard Weld Award for biography. So with that, I will welcome Rebekah and congratulations. That's such a great
Thank you.
start off.
Thank you so much, Louise. And it's such an honor to be in discussion with you today. I'm delighted to talk about my book with you.
Fantastic. You know, as soon as I read, I think, a brief description of your book, like a capsule summary, maybe in the New Yorker, I was like, I have to read that. I want to read that. And as soon as I did, I just knew that it was going to be kind of so aligned with the Skirball and their mission. And, you know, as Isabel mentioned, specifically the commandment, you know, to pursue just, you know, you shall not stand idly by while your neighbor bleeds, which is under their so many, you know, honoring memory, which you have done and we'll hear more about. And I just want to say, your book is also just such a terrific read. I mean, it's a biography and it's also really a thriller, even though, as we'll hear from you soon, we know what's going to happen in a sense, but we don't know how it happened. And I thought maybe you could start us off by reading a portion of the introduction.
Oh, yes, I'd be happy to. Okay. 2 seconds here. All right. Introduction. Her aim was self-erasure. The more invisible she was, the better her chances of survival. In her journal, she noted what she ate, read, thought. The first was uncontroversial. The second and third were not. For this reason, she hid the journal. When she suspected the Gestapo was closing in on her, she destroyed it, burned it, most likely. She was at the harrowing center of the German resistance, but she wasn't German, nor was she Polish or French. She was American, conspicuously so. The men she recruited acquired code names: Armless, Beamer, Worker. She operated under no code name. Still, she was elusive. The nature of her work required absolute secrecy. She didn't dare tell her family, who were scattered across the towns and dairy farms of the Midwest. They remained bewildered that she, at 26, had jumped aboard a steamer ship and crossed the Atlantic, leaving behind everyone she loved. Her family is my family. 3 generations separate us. She preferred anonymity, so I will whisper her name, Mildred Harnack. In 1932, she held her first clandestine meeting in her apartment, a small band of political activists that grew into the largest underground resistance group in Berlin by the end of the decade. During the Second World War, her group collaborated with a Soviet espionage network that conspired to defeat Hitler, employing agents and operatives in Paris, Geneva, Brussels, and Berlin. In the fall of 1942, the Gestapo pounced. She was thrown in prison. So were her co-conspirators. During a hastily convened trial at the Reichskriegsgericht, the Reich Court Martial, a prosecutor who'd earned the moniker Hitler's bloodhound hammered them with questions. She sat on a wooden chair in the back of the courtroom. Other chairs held high-ranking Nazi officers. At the center of the room sat a panel of 5 judges. Everyone there was German except her. When it was her turn, she approached the stand. She was emaciated, her lungs ravaged by tuberculosis she'd contracted in prison. How long she stood there remains unknown. Surviving documents don't note the time the prosecutor began questioning her or the time he stopped. What is known is this: the answers she gave him were lies, real whoppers. The judges believed her. The sentence she received was considered mild: 6 years of hard labor in a prison camp. 2 days later, Hitler overrode the verdict and ordered her execution. On February 16, 1943, she was strapped to a guillotine and beheaded.
That's a very, very powerful, powerful beginning. Thank you for reading that. Tell us about, she is your great aunt, but how much did you know about her? Tell us how much you knew about her growing up and why this story so consumed you.
I heard about her in whispers here and there when I was growing up. I was aware that my great grandmother, who was her eldest sister, had a lot of feelings about her and was very conflicted. She was, as a 9-year-old, I sensed that she was angry, but I didn't know toward whom or why. I just knew that something tragic had happened to Mildred. And I also got the sense from my grandmother, who was Mildred's niece, that Mildred had done something brave. And so the story I started to piece the story together as I grew up and as my family started telling me more. And my grandmother, when I was 16, gave me Mildred's letters and urged me to write her story one day. So I kept my promise.
That's pretty cosmic when someone hands you something and, and I mean, it's really entrusting you with something. You were carrying Mildred's story.
It is. It was a tremendous inheritance, and I felt a tremendous responsibility. And so at that time, she knew I wanted to be a writer, and I felt I was quite clear about the notion that it would take a long time for me to really do justice to the story. And I imagined that I would have to undertake a lot of archival research as well. I mean, I would, of course, have to go beyond the letters. I actually took down from my shelf, this is the binder with copies of her letters.
Wow.
So you see very much, I've worked with them extensively. And but of course I needed to do a whole lot more. And so indeed, I eventually did. I mean, I published 2 works of fiction and over the course of about 10 years, while I was working on a 3rd work of fiction, a novel, I started to do preliminary research, and I went to Berlin to the Gedenkstätte Deutsche Widerstand, which is the German Resistance Memorial Center, and I and introduced myself to them. I knew that my grandmother had given some materials to them, and I knew that there were other materials as well that would be helpful. And then I began to also visit other archives in London and across the United States. Library of Congress, the National Archives, and eventually, when I started this book, really researching it writing the manuscript in earnest, and I got a fellowship at the Leon Levy Center for Biography in New York. I was able to get in touch with a historian who was based in Moscow, and who had some access to some archival documents. So many of them are under lock and key, of course. But there was a moment in the early 90s when they opened up for just a glimpse and then shut tight again. And so then I was able to use some of those documents as well.
You are a novelist. I mean, you had experience as a novelist, but you made a very specific decision to tell this not as historical fiction. And it's interesting because I was reading this, and then I'm also preparing for Olga Tokarczuk in a few weeks for the Skirball. So that's a great historical novel for which she did years and years of research. You did years and years of research, yeah. but you use the novelist skills that you have because you've chosen to tell it in the present tense to give us a sense, yes, and to walk us, to take us through the story, the buildup into the rise of fascism in Germany.
Yes, well, I felt that because I had published works of fiction, I was urged early on by some editors and agents to write this as a work of historical fiction, and I felt that very strongly that was not the right genre, and that the power of the story is that it is true, and so I really stuck to my guns and insisted that it had to be a work of deeply researched narrative nonfiction. And then I started to conceptualize this and I knew that also I didn't want this to be a conventional biography, a kind of cradle to grave biography. I wanted I was thinking like a novelist, and I wanted to engage readers with this story in a way that would it's a very absorbing and fascinating story, and so I thought, well, instead of footnotes, I'll do endnotes, and I have a lengthy endnotes in the back, but you don't have to stumble over footnotes while you're reading the book. And I also thought, well, I want to write this in the present tense because I want to give a sense of immediacy, and I want readers to feel as if they are on the streets of Berlin with Mildred and witnessing the rise of fascism. I think it should be remembered that the year before she went to Berlin to pursue her PhD in 1928, the year before that, the Nazi Party received less than 3% of the vote in the Reichstag election in Germany's parliament. 2 years later, that number rose to 18%. And 2 years later, that number rose to 37%. And for the first time, the Nazi Party was the largest political party in the Reichstag. And so this happened very rapidly. And Mildred was there as an American graduate student, bearing witness to the rise of fascism. And so I wanted to, again, write this in the present tense so that readers would also have the sense, not that they're looking at I always think of these newsreels, these black and white newsreels, where you have this sense of events happening oh so very long ago, and these sort of best-case narratives, the sepia tone, and unfortunately, the result of that is that these stories feel that they're not topical and they're not relevant, and I felt that this story very much is.
Well, give us a sense of what, so Mildred and her husband Arvid, who is German, are living in Berlin, and they have formed this circle, the circle of resistance, but it's a very fledgling organization, and they're looking for places to meet and strategize. read us, give us a sense of Mildred's day on January 30th, 1933. That was pages 46 to 47. And give us a sense of what that
yes.
felt like in Berlin.
You want me to just read a little bit?
Yeah,
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
I'll keep this brief. But just so people can get a sense of this. So yes, it's January 1933. Mildred has lived in Hasenheide 61 for 6 months. She loves this apartment. The rent is the equivalent of $17 a month, more than she and Arvid wanted to pay, but they're adept at getting by on little. So many others in Germany get by on far less. While Arvid puts the finishing touches on his first book, it is slated for publication next year, Mildred translates a German book on sports, 500 single-spaced pages. It's an enormous project, and she's paid nearly nothing for her labors. Nothing's changed. To supplement her income, she teaches a class at the Commercial University, an uninspired institution that shares nothing of the vision of the BAG. It's an acronym for a Berlin night school for adults, where she was teaching. On January 29, 1933, Mildred sits down at a desk to write a letter to her mother. She writes, "There's so much work for her in the world." Pardon me. There's so much work. There's so much to work for in the world nowadays. Never have there been so many glorious prospects. She rests her pen on the page. What passes through her mind then? A flutter of insecurity, a twinge of self-doubt. She has been unfocused at times. She hasn't always planned ahead. In previous letters, she has admitted that she daydreams. "I'm trying to get rid of old habits," she writes now, "to see my main path ever more clearly." If she felt self-doubt, it's purged now. She continues the letter, resolute. "I'm 30 years old and a free woman. I have the work I want. There are no insurmountable obstacles to advancing in it. Life is good." The next evening, Mildred strides into the classroom, clutching her leather satchel. "Tonight, the class will not be singing songs or discussing literature," she tells them. "Instead, they will discuss a historic event. It is January 30, 1933. Hitler has just been appointed Chancellor of Germany."
Yeah, that's really remarkable. And two things I wanted to comment on, one of which is that you're telling us what happened based on your research, but also you are imagining what might have happened in that moment as you're seeing her as a novelist. And I what also really stands out for me, and I wanted to ask you about, is Mildred's resolve. I mean, when you think about being an upstander, being a resistor, why Mildred? Why did she and her husband from so early on, what prepared them to take the kind of risk they were about to take that others didn't?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, because it really speaks to why others in the group also found themselves willing to take a risk and risk their lives. And it was quite clear early on that that was indeed what they were doing. I think it should be remembered, number one, that Mildred grew up in an impoverished household. Her mother had a 10th grade education. Her father was a frequently unemployed butcher, insurance salesman, and horse trader. So she grew up in a shuffle of boarding houses. It also must be, so, her passion for the poor stemmed from her very personal experience. In that binder of letters I showed you, there's a letter where her mother is writing to another family member, talking about how she's worried that she doesn't have enough, that Mildred doesn't have enough to eat as a teenager because they simply can't, she couldn't afford to buy groceries very often. Number two, Mildred was the daughter of a suffragette. So Georgina, her mother, was a suffragette, and deeply inspired by the progressive movement in Wisconsin, which is where she was born and raised, which is, of course, the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment in 1919 and grant women the right to vote. So So Mildred grew up in this radicalized environment, and she was further radicalized at the University of Wisconsin, where she joined a student group called the Friday Nighters, which was a fizzy mix of self-proclaimed communists and social democrats and anti-fascists. And she marched in demonstrations after she met Arvid Harnack, who was a German student there to do research on his PhD. After they got married, they fell swiftly in love, and they were they were quite united by their political convictions. And so, right after they got married, shortly thereafter, they marched along in a picket line. They hitchhiked to Colorado, marched in a picket line at a strike protesting poor pay and poor working conditions for coal miners. So even before they went to Germany, both Mildred and her husband felt very inclined to make their political beliefs known and public.
So that that they were primed in a sense that she'd come up through this kind of progressive ranks. I think she and Arvid also went to Mexico on a trip together.
Yeah, they did. And before they had this idea that they would travel around the world and advocate for the poor. And that really tells you about where their minds and hearts were.
And Arvid was also a cousin of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, right?
Yes, that's right. So
and
yes,
Arvid, yeah. And that very same day of Hitler being appointed chancellor was kind of the first act of public defiance was Bonhoeffer's letter, I think, right? You put that
it was just a couple days later. Yes, it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he was in his mid-20s, and he was a Lutheran pastor, and he was still in school at that point actually, and he gave a radio address, and that is basically considered by historians to be the first public act of defiance against the Nazi regime. And so, yes, so Dietrich Bonhoeffer was Arvid Harnack's, he was related. The Bonhoeffers, the Dohnanyis, and the Delbrooks were families that Arvid basically grew up with, their families, they intermarried, and these families all contributed to the resistance, and many of them were executed, not only just.
So when you think about in Timothy Snyder's book, which is now beautifully illustrated by Nora
Oh,
Crook,
isn't it marvelous?
Yeah,
I
really
love
great.
that.
On tyranny.
The graphic version.
Yeah.
Yes.
And also both of these, and this beautiful book, thank you, Book Soup. We're going to keep dropping the link in the chat because Rebekah also signed some book plates. Thank you for that. But I was thinking about in tyranny, on tyranny, you know, number one is do not obey in advance. And here Mildred and Arvid, he says, because he was talking in the book how easily, because people voluntarily extended their services to the new leaders, Nazis and communists alike, that they realized they could move quickly towards a full regime change. Because you just read January 30th, 1933, by March, there are 20,000 political prisoners by March 1933. That's 3 months later. And by the end of the year, over 200,000 communist, social democrats, and trade unionists have been put in protective custody at concentration centers. So what Mildred sees, you're able to describe that speed with which it's happening.
It was just a breathtaking speed. And in my book, yes, I take the reader through the legal steps as well, because all of this, people who are unfamiliar with the history tend to assume that Hitler became chancellor and this was due to some kind of coup, a military coup, bullets and blood. But it was an entirely legal process. And there were a series of decrees, the Decree for the Protection of the People, then there was the Enabling Act, that all basically hastened this development from a parliamentary democracy, which during the Weimar era, Germany had a constitution that gave women the right to vote, that protected freedom of speech, freedom to assemble and in public squares and protest. Berlin had 90 daily newspapers that represented every political view, from this extreme left to the extreme right and everything in between. And during this, immediately after Hitler was appointed chancellor, also something else that not to be too rudimentary about this, but I think it's very important to underscore that that again, this was done all according to regulations, but very swiftly after he was appointed chancellor and through legal means, Germany proceeded from a parliamentary democracy to a fascist dictatorship.
So now people have to find a way to communicate if they're going to resist when they know that their lives are going to be in danger. Let's talk a little bit about how that happened. There's a fascinating book out just coming out by Gal Beckerman, which is on the unexpected origins of radical ideas in different periods of time. So in Tahrir Square, it's Facebook. In Mildred and Arvid's time, they meet clandestinely, with their group, but also sometimes it's by courier. And tell us a bit about the person you were able to find who really was in there at the center of it with Mildred.
Well, yes, and Mildred, just to speak very quickly about her recruitment, her first pool of recruits were really her students at the University of Berlin, where she lectured about American literature, and also at this Berlin Night School for Adults.
Wasn't that very dangerous? I mean, so she had to, you were describing how she had to kind of pretend to be, you couldn't just come out and ask someone what their politics were. You had to kind of
Yes, and it was an intuitive process, and she was very, very careful. The group started before Hitler became chancellor in 1932, but in its very incipient beginnings, just meeting in cafes and in her apartment, discussing the rise of the Nazi Party and what to do about it. There was a lot of reading of texts and discussions, but then after Hitler became chancellor, then the discussions progressed to really addressing the question, now what action can we take? And so one of Mildred's chief objectives was to expand the group. And so yes, it was a very dangerous process. And I write about that extensively in the book, really. So it didn't always work out for her. And she was aware that if she tried to recruit the wrong person, that person could turn her into the Gestapo, and she would be thrown in prison. But that never happened. It nearly happened several times. And she tried to recruit the British writer Rebekah West in London. She was put in touch with her through contacts in the resistance.
I love that scene. That's a great scene.
Yes. Basically, Rebekah West misunderstood because one of the ways that Mildred tried to sort of test out somebody's political allegiances was to first pretend that she was a fan of Hitler. And she approached Rebekah West and said, the Fuhrer is so, would I'm sure be very grateful if you would have your works translated into German, and what a fine thing this would be for Germany. You have to understand how Mildred's, really, she was living a double life, and she had to have this sort of this appearance of being this loyal Nazi in order to undermine the regime from within. Anyway, suffice it to say, Rebekah West threw her out on her ear and was appalled, and rightly so. If Mildred had indeed not been posturing. And then later, after Mildred was executed, years later, Rebekah West wrote to Alan Dulles and said, "I had no idea." But getting back to your question, yes. It was tremendously dangerous. She did use a courier, an 11-year-old courier. He was the son of a diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin, Donald Heath Sr. It's a fascinating part of the history. And one of my objectives too was to really go into this extensively because people don't quite understand the connection that Mildred Harnack made with the United States. It is known historically that she and Arvid made connections with the Soviet Union and passed intelligence to the Soviet Union to essentially undermine Hitler and give secrets to Hitler's enemies, Stalin. But the espionage connection with the United States is much less known. So Donald Heath Sr. had a confidential agreement between Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau, Assistant Secretary of State George Messersmith, and Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles. And basically between 1938 and 1941, he worked in Berlin as a kind of ad hoc intelligence agent for the US government. And remember, this is before we had a foreign intelligence service, and it's pre OSS. And there was the soon to be formed Office of the Coordinator of Information, which really just lasted for less than a year. And then that gave way to the OSS. And so Heath worked for this in this sort of nexus of this between the Treasury Department, the State Department, and the COI. And he used his son, his 11-year-old son, to basically pass information back and forth between Mildred and Arvid and
he would go there for tutoring, right? He was.
That's right. Yes, for tutoring sessions. So between 1939 and 1941, Donald Heath, between the ages of 11 and 13, he would show up at Mildred's apartment, ostensibly for tutoring sessions in American and English literature. And indeed, she did tutor him quite enthusiastically. And he told me all about it. I tracked him down when he was 89 years old and interviewed him extensively. And what a glorious discovery that was when I discovered that he was still, alive and that I could actually sit down in front of him and ask him all the questions I wanted so much to ask him. So. And so he described these tutoring sessions that we had with Mildred. He had a vivid recollection of what he smelled, what our apartment looked like, and what she said. And at the end of these sessions, she would slip a piece of paper into his knapsack, which he would then take to his father, who would type up these reports to Morgenthau with the subject line "From Heath to Treasury." And then send them off to the State Department in DC. And I found these cables in the presidential library, the FDR Presidential Library in Hyde Park. So I was able to connect the dots. And anyway, so I should mention that the notes that Mildred slipped in, chiefly contained information about meeting places where they could meet outside of Berlin at the Spreewald, for example, where they could exchange confidential intelligence, without Gestapo surveillance, and exchange it verbally. So this was, again, to avoid getting arrested with incriminating evidence on them.
So eventually, of course, Mildred is arrested. Other members of the circle are arrested. And I found the whole section in the prison, one of them, it's a deeply moving part of the book. And I have a couple of questions for you about that. I mean, there was such sadism there. Mildred was denied paper and pencil. Your phrase, women shuffling in the yard like withered leaves. But again, this passing, this communication, they're keeping their spirit up by passing notes around. And I was wondering, since this is such a personal story to you, something we have in common, we've both written, done history on family members that we sort of, almost in a sense, going through this curtain of history, like you can contact. But then when you start to get information, as I did with my aunt, great aunt in Poland, and you get these official lists, and there she is on a list or a labor detail, and it's sometimes I would just go for days, and I wondered how did you deal with those kinds of emotions with this, or not to assume that you had them, but
yes. Oh, well, it's, excavating all of this history can be a very yes, emotional experience, and complex. I mean, I'm just flipping right here as you're talking. So this is an example of a note that I found that was passed in prison, and between Mildred's the women in Mildred's group after they were arrested by the Gestapo. And in this note, the woman who's writing the note is talking about how somebody else in the group basically gave Mildred up and told the Gestapo during her interrogation a lot of incriminating things. And Mildred thought that this woman was her friend, and of course this woman was trying to save her own skin.
And didn't, right?
And she yes, she got executed with everybody else, and it's a Libertas Schulze-Boysen, who is often characterized as just given a sort of one-note characterization, which is she was so heroic. And unfortunately, that's the history of a lot of these people, though, and chiefly it has focused on the men, I should also point out, but they tend to be lacking in nuance. And so I really wanted to, with this book too, bring forth a sense of who these people were. They are human beings with flaws, with and warts and all. I'm flipping also just to show you a visual of, these are the Gestapo mug shots of the group.
Those are amazing. And they were
Catholics, they were Jews, they were atheists. 40% were women, and that was something that the Gestapo was quite after the war. There was a post-war testimony. One officer said we had no idea. There was just this that they were baffled that so many women were involved. But getting back to your question about the emotion, yes, I mean, of course. When you're reading about people being imprisoned and people being decapitated, and what happened to the women in this group extended beyond that, they were also dissected by Hermann Stieve, who was the head of the anatomy department at the University of Berlin, and he had a special arrangement with the director of Plattensee prison to deliver the bodies of these women to him so that he could research the effects of acute stress on the female reproductive system. And his career, because he had a ready supply of women's bodies, he was able to publish a lot of papers, and his career, he benefited from this. And just a couple of years ago, the microscopic remains of some of these women were discovered, and they were given a proper burial. But very gruesome part of history. I mean,
yeah, it's tough.
It's just one episode of a very gruesome, time for everyone.
Well, one of the other admonitions, of course, in on tyranny is be courageous, and Mildred was.
Yeah.
And you do a beautiful job of bringing to light her being, a sense of her. Why do you have two final questions before we go to open up to audience questions? One is, why do we know so little about the German resistance? Why? Because the archives were not available, because it was covered up, because there wasn't a lot of it, because why?
Those are three excellent reasons. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So I think that the recognition that so many Germans supported the Nazi regime has tended to silence the stories of those who did courageously stand up and oppose it. So we haven't heard these stories. Number one, these groups that formed during the Nazi regime were fractured. They emerged fitfully. They were weakened by attrition, and they never posed a serious threat to Hitler's rule. As you mentioned earlier, within a few months, 20,000 communists and social democrats and trade unionists were thrown into concentration camps. Hitler made it a priority to get rid of his political enemies. He started with those on the left, and then a year later, he moved on to those on the right. And the Night of Long Knives, which I also describe in my book, where his political enemies were all slaughtered, or many of them, I should say. And so, and here, this group that Mildred nicknamed the Circle was really, it intersected with 3 other groups, and had ties with groups like the Kaisau Circle, but these other 3 groups were sort of more centrally involved with Mildred's sort of nascent group in her apartment in Berlin. And they formed a kind of interlocking chain. But just to give you a sense of the numbers, this group by 1940, there were about 60 Germans in this group, and they continued to recruit through the Second World War. And in 1942, the Gestapo arrested 119 of them. So these are not big numbers.
Right.
In one of these small groups that her group intersected with,
Well,
there were 6 people in it in 1937.
Well, it makes her all the more remarkable. I mean, when you think about, the risk around them, it's just phenomenal. And I know that when you were finishing writing the book, didn't you just finish it like a few days before, or a few days after January 6th, 20?
Oh, I was still working on my final draft, or the copy edited draft, I should say. I mean, this is when you're making sure all the T's are dotted, but I think that I was still, and I was adding little bits and pieces to the bibliography and the endnotes, but yes, I was still working on. I mean, really, my editor had to sort of take it out of my hands. I could have continued working on it for another decade, but yes, and I think that all along, as I had said, I had this sense that I wanted to write this in the present tense, so that readers could feel understand how topical the story is, and could sense some of the parallels. And I think that in our current time of resurgent authoritarianism, the mechanics of Hitler's rise are particularly topical. And I mean, there's no way in which I'm sort of presenting a one-to-one correlation, but it can't be denied that they're both a certain former president and Hitler brilliantly used propaganda machines to brainwash, to spread lies, to spread disinformation, and both are demagogues and seek support by appealing to popular desires and prejudices, and utilized, Hitler utilized the radio in ways that have never been done before. That the People's Radio, which reached Germans for the very first time in the country, in rural areas. And of course, we have on the other side of things, Twitter, which also was unprecedented in terms of a sitting president's.
So to give a portrait of, as you construct the rise of this, and we feel the parallels, but it's so important to have this portrait of a resistor and to think about what it takes to be a resistor.
Yeah.
And I thank you, because it's an archetype that in a particular story that really is so important. Now, I think we have some questions coming in.
And I think we can all I hope that the story inspires people to basically stand up to bullies, and that's what we're talking about.
It is absolutely true. And I think that you get into such detail about how they did it, and finding the way, is. I mean, Mildred loved life. She didn't want to die. They didn't want to die. They were going to go to Sweden.
Yes, that's right. They finally, when one member was arrested, Harro Schulze-Boysen, Arvid and Mildred took off and went to Nazi-occupied Lithuania, hoping to escape to Sweden. And the Gestapo tracked them down. There's a senior SS officer, Horst Kopko, who basically personally wanted to arrest them, and also personally oversaw their interrogation and torture.
Yeah.
And after the war, he was recruited by MI6, and that gave him a false name. Peter Cordes faked his death and gave him a false identity as a textile factory manager. And so, and that part of the story is also important to go basically to address your earlier question, which is why don't we know, why didn't we know about this group? One reason was that both US and British intelligence recruited Nazis who were involved in this group and involved in overseeing their torture, execution, recruited them as sources after the war, when then they were viewed through a kind of Cold War lens. And both the US government and the British government thought that they would be valuable sources that would enable them to understand more about the threat of communism, and specifically a Soviet espionage network that these Nazis duped the US and then British intelligence into thinking that they had this vast knowledge of this, what turned out to be a fictional, vast Soviet espionage network. But they, anyway, they succeeded in avoiding being tried as war criminals in Nuremberg.
Let me ask a few of the audience questions here.
Sure.
Someone asked, were Mildred and or Arvid honored as righteous among the nations?
Were they honored
as right at Yad Vashem, as righteous among the nations?
I mean, they've been honored over the decades. Initially, they were honored in the Soviet Union and in East Germany as heroes of communists. So they were sort of, the communist governments sort of claimed them as their own, and in the Soviet Union, they were given medals of honor. They appeared on an East German postage stamp, but that was the extent of the honors. And in the U.S., actually, U.S. intelligence documents that surfaced after the 1998 Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act basically mandated the release of all of these documents. An intelligent document shows that the US government actually, one official declared that Mildred's execution was justified. So here's an American woman who's trying to fight the Nazi regime, and the US government finds her execution justified. So she was not honored here. Until after the Cold War, after some of these documents came out, then especially in Wisconsin, then there was a day named after her due to some wonderful efforts of certain people who have followed her career. Art Heitzer, who basically went to the Wisconsin government and said, we need to honor her. There's a school there now named after her, the school in Berlin as well. And now there are monuments that are being erected both in Germany and that were recently erected just at the University of Gießen, and also in Wisconsin, but no other honors besides that.
How much of a challenge did foreign languages, it's another audience question, such as German or Russian, present as you conducted your research of historical material?
Again, I was fortunate that I worked with, I initially thought I'm going to jump on a plane and fly to Moscow and go through and basically doggedly pursue whatever documents I can pursue, knowing again that they're essentially under lock and key. At least the intelligence, the NKVD files, for example. But I did, as I mentioned, work with a Moscow-based historian, and so she. I mean, I don't speak German. I don't speak Russian. I don't read Russian. And so I needed to hire somebody to help me with these documents. And with when I went to the German archives, I went to Lüneburg. I took about 2,000 pages out of that archive and took them back to New York. I needed help going through them all. I mean, I certainly couldn't do it all alone. So I did work with several research assistants to enable me to go through all of this material. And really that was a cheap challenge. I mean, I was dogged in my research, exhausted in my research. And so sorting through it all and deciding what to focus on, what was important, what was not so important, was a tremendous undertaking. And I was also aware that I wanted, I really started writing the manuscript in earnest right in the run up to the 2016 presidential election. And I felt that it was important. I felt readers need to hear this story now. So I didn't want to take 10 years and sort of ploddingly go through this. So yet another reason that I worked with other assistants to help me go through it all.
What couldn't you include in the book, someone asks, and whether you're planning a future work that may include those cut segments?
Yeah. I could, as I mentioned earlier, I could have kept writing this book for another decade. It is just a voluminous story, and it kept expanding and expanding, and I really felt that I wanted to include many different kinds of people who Mildred encountered. And so I talk about Martha Dodd and her father, the ambassador, and they were in Berlin before the Heaths came. And so I talk about the world of the diplomats there, the Americans, the journalists who were there, and I did an exhaustive study of memoirs that were published by survivors of Mildred's group. There weren't many, but there were a few, including Greta Kukoff and Gunther Weissenborn, and they gave me a wonderful glimpse into other aspects of the story, so that I could approach this from sort of multiple perspectives. And I also I wanted to make sure that I told the espionage part of the story in a way that would also account for the history. And so I did a tremendous amount of research on Soviet espionage and the figures in the NKVD, and I talk about the purges and Stalin's purges, and I tracked down the woman who received the intelligence that Arvid Harnack and his co-conspirator Haro Schulze-Boysen, they were basically stealing secrets, posing as loyal Nazis within Hitler's ministries. Arvid was at the Ministry of Economics. Haro was with the Luftwaffe, so he had access to military secrets. And they stole this information and they gave it to the Soviet Union. So basically, some of those, to answer the question, in all of these people that I mentioned, there were larger stories that I had to leave out. And so I also felt that it was important to determine where compression would enable me to tell the story, give just enough sense of the scope without losing focus. And that was one of my primary artistic challenges.
It blew my mind that someone else had asked, what were the circle actually doing? Well, you just gave an example that, some people worked from inside agencies or official government channels, but then they got this information to Stalin, who didn't believe it.
Oh yes, that's it, and that's it. That's why so I actually feature in the book. I also made a point of featuring documents. So again, to sort of bring this history alive. But this right here is Stalin's handwriting, and this I obtained from an archive in the Soviet Union, in Russia now, so Soviet era files, and this was him scrawling across this report that basically contained all of this intelligence that Arvid and Haro had obtained, risking their lives. And I was about to say, I tracked down the woman who basically typed all these up, and I do a little sort of almost character study of her too. I wanted, very much wanted to tell the stories of those who have not yet, had their voices heard on all sides of the story. So there was this woman working with a bunch of men at Moscow Center, and she was the one receiving all this stuff, typing it up, and here's the report. And Stalin didn't believe it. He thought that basically that these Germans who claimed to be in the resistance were trying to double cross him. And so he scrawls across, and you see the handwriting there, but he scrawls an obscenity across it. And this is in a chapter called Stalin's Obscenity. And so, yes, anyway, if you read the book, you can, I offer a translation, but I'm not going to say it.
Well, I really strongly recommend this book. It's a fantastic read, Rebekah. I'm so excited for you, and
Thank you, Louise.
I'm sure the book will continue to expand. This story is.
Yes, my next book will also. I am going to continue in this
great
period and with these themes. So yes.
That'd be great. It'd be great.
More development along these lines. Yes. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And I think Isabel will welcome you back on for final remarks. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I mean, thank you, both of you, for being here with us today. I mean, I'm just in awe, Rebekah, of this story of just extraordinary courage. I mean, it's so inspiring, and I thank you for sharing this story, not just with us, but with the world. I mean, just being such an incredible writer. And
thank you so much.
And thank you everybody for tuning in today, this afternoon. And please check out the link. Our friends at Book Soup can get the book from them directly through the link that's in the chat. Thank you so much. Have a look at our website again for our upcoming book talks. And again, thank you, Louise. Thank you, Rebekah. And we hope to welcome everybody to the Skirball as soon as we can. So thank you.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you. Goodbye.